Good evening, TALC campers, or good morning, or afternoon, or whatever time it is, where and when you're doing this. I'm Keith Gamble, and I'm here to talk to you in a Bible study about work. And work is pretty important. It can be up to a third of your life, maybe a little more if you're a crazy hard worker. And it's something that people tend to get a bad attitude about easily, and so I want you to be able to know what the Bible has to say about work. So on the first slide, Genesis 2:2, and on the seventh day God finished this work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So I don't really know what it means for God to work. I have no idea how hard the work was for him. It certainly would be hard for me, I suspect. But it establishes this idea of the Sabbath with this idea that God worked and then he rested. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy because on it, God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. So God was creating, that was the work he was doing. Like I said, I don't know how that's done, but he established this pattern of 6 days of work, followed by a seventh day of rest that was set aside. That's what the word holy means in this context, or that's part of what that means, and was special. So next slide. Before the fall of man, Genesis, we have 2:5, when no bush in the field was yet in the land, and no small plant in the field yet sprung up. Lord had not caused it to rain on the ground, and there was no man to work the ground. So we see that God had in mind for man to work the ground. I call this gardening. He was working in the Garden of Eden. The Lord took the man, put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. So if you ever get into the question of what's the oldest type of work, gardening is apparently the answer. So in the next slide, I titled this Gardening 101. If you know about college courses, 101 is usually the first in a series and the lowest level work. So in 3:23 of Genesis, therefore the Lord God sent him out from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he was taken. Now, because I've skipped over some things, you don't see here that the fall of man has happened. Adam and Eve have been rebellious towards God, and so this sending out is sending them out into exile. They are no longer allowed to be in the Garden of Eden. And then for the next quote from Genesis 4:12, when you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. Now that's not speaking to Adam and Eve, that's speaking to Cain. And this was the curse on Cain, that he would be a wanderer and that working the ground would no longer be an option for him. He had been a farmer before. And then in Genesis 5:29, he called his name Noah, saying, out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and the painful toil of our hands. So without this passage, I don't know that we would have said that the ground was cursed, but here it says that. So we believe that there was a general hardship on farming, working the ground, that at least was operative before the flood, because Noah is prophesied to be the one through whom this curse will end. So relief from our work and the painful toil of our hands. So if you see work described that way as painful toil, that can lead you to thinking negatively about work. But there's reasons, and we'll get into that, why you shouldn't be thinking negatively about work. And so now bringing it up, next slide, Haggai chapter 1, these are just little ideas from that chapter. Their problem there was that they had ceased to work on the temple. And so God had inspired people to return to Jerusalem after their exile, had inspired them to start the temple. They did the foundation, and then they encountered, encountered opposition, and they ceased to work. And there are perhaps many reasons. Obviously, one was fear of what other people would do to them. So God says to them, give careful thought to your ways. And when God says that to you, it means, watch out, you're not doing well. You have planted much but harvested little, so things aren't going well. And then it talks about eating and drinking, putting on clothing, and none of that is going well. But God is saying to them, build my house, then I will build yours. Effectively, that's very much of a free translation. And God will stop tearing it down too. The problems they were having were essentially tearing down their work of their hands. So your problems in that situation, as described in Haggai, are from sin. And God is revealing that to them. And so the next slide, the nature of man revealed. So I said this because it's talking about the slavery of the people of Israel in Egypt. And when people put other people into slavery, that reveals the sinful nature of man. It's something that comes naturally to a fallen person of mankind. So they made them work ruthlessly, as it says, as slaves. And working as a slave is another thing that gives you a negative idea about work, what it's all about, because it's a very warped kind of work where you're working for someone else in hardship and in suffering and compulsion. And then the second part of that slide, Exodus 12:16, on the first day you shall hold a holy assembly, and on the seventh day a holy assembly. No work shall be done on those days, but what everyone needs to eat, that alone may be prepared by you. So this is giving a restriction on work on certain special holy days. So the Sabbath and also the first day of this feast, I believe it is. I didn't check to see which that was referring to. So next slide, I have a joke type of title on there. You might think, is God retired or unemployed as a joke? But I'm serious about this question, because if you think God only worked when he did creation and then he quit work for all time since then, that gives you a different idea about who God is than if he's still working. And so Exodus 14:13, and Moses said to the people, fear not, stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. So this, when they were about to cross the Reed Sea, and God was going to save them. And so saving the people was the work that God was doing. God's work are a little different than ours. I can't save a million people, but God can. So Exodus 29-10, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. And then it goes into the detail of who's not supposed to work so that you don't try to weasel out of it. But it's really easy to read that passage and just think about the Sabbath that you're not supposed to work on and forget the first part says, 6 days you shall labor. So work is important. It's something that God has laid out for us to do 6 days out of 7. And I would say that you can't really rest on the seventh day unless you've been working on the other 6. It's the contrast between your work and your rest that produces this pattern that God has set out for us. So next slide. Why do we do this, God, is the title I put on that. So Exodus 23:12, 6 days you shall do your work, but on the seventh day you shall rest. So that's repeating this previous passage idea. And I put in the word so. That's not in the original passage, but I put in there to help the thinking of it. That your ox and your donkey may have rest, and the son of your servant woman and the alien may be refreshed. So it gives some insight into why we have this pattern of working and then resting. And of course, the seventh day isn't only about rest. It says it's a holy day, which has other implications for it, that we particularly want to be thinking about God on that day. But it doesn't mean we're not thinking about God on the other days. So next slide, work is good, but working 7 bad. Finishing with that idea that Exodus 31:14, you shall keep the Sabbath because it is holy for you. Everyone who profanes it shall be put to death. Yes, God was very serious about this. And then the next one, 6 days your work shall be done. The seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day shall be put to death. So not just one place that it says that. And why God sets up death penalties, I'm not going to get into that right now, but every time you see one, God's taken that idea really seriously, and we're meant to as well. So in the next slide, we're talking about the work of God again. The tablets were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God engraved on the tablets. So God doesn't just create, he doesn't just save, he also writes and creates tablets, among other things. And he's still doing it. That's one of the key points here. He's not just stopped working at the seventh day of creation. And then Exodus 34:10, and he said, "Behold, I am making a covenant before all your people. I will do marvels such as have not been created in all the earth or in any nation, and all the people among whom you are shall see the work of the Lord, for it is an awesome thing." So the work of God is awesome. One thing we take from that. Awe-inspiring, something to floor us, make us amazed. But also, God is making a covenant, which is the word we use most often in the Bible, but basically means contract, a deal. He's making a deal with us that he's going to do this, but this deal with us doesn't just involve us, a conditional thing where we're going to do something, he's going to do something. God's making a one-sided contract. He's just saying, I'm going to do this. So it's also, you could see it as a promise. So he's going to do marvels, more of the work of God, miracles. So the next slide is titled Mankind and All Creation. And Job 34:19, who shows no partiality to princes, nor regards the rich more than the poor, for they are all the work of his hands. So this word work is appearing again in this context, is talking about all of us being God's creation, and therefore there's an equality of that, not only in the creation, but God carries on the equality in how he deals with us. He doesn't show partiality. Psalm 8:3, when you look at the heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place. I think it's pretty obvious it's talking about God here, because the rest of us don't make heavens with our fingers or set the moon and stars in place. Psalm 33:4, for the work of the Lord is upright, and all his work is done in faithfulness. So this is another important point about God's work, that it's good. It's done with a, if you will, right attitude. It's done for the right reasons and ends up the right way, something that we don't always achieve. So next slide, working for God and the work of God. So Exodus 39:43, and Moses saw all the work, and behold, they had done it as the Lord had commanded. So they had done it. Then Moses blessed them. So this is talking about the tabernacle, and when they built it, God gave certain instructions on how it was to go and how it was to look and what it was to be made out of. And they did all that exactly according to God's commands. And so that's why Moses is blessing them in this situation. Then Deuteronomy 11:7, for your eyes have seen all the great work of the Lord that he did. So this is talking about being brought out of Egypt and being saved from slavery and from being killed by the Egyptians and killed by the Amalekites and all the other things they were saved from. That's the great work that we're referring to here. In Deuteronomy 32:4, the rock, referring to God, his work is perfect, for all his ways are justice, God of faithfulness and without iniquity, just and upright is he. So God's work is perfect. It doesn't have any flaws in it. The flaw in God's work, if you want to say, is in our fallen nature isn't God's doing. It's our rebellious nature working it out. It causes sin. Next slide, work for God opposed by men. So in Haggai 2:4, coming back to this idea of rebuilding the temple after the exile, yet now be strong, O Zerubbabel, declares the Lord. Be strong, O Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Be strong, all you people of the land, declares the Lord. Work, for I am with you, declares the Lord of hosts. So God is commanding work in this specific instance, and a specific kind of work. It's the work on the temple that they're commanded to do. And the key word there is, I am with you, or the key phrase, because God is saying, you can do this, even though you're going to face human opposition, because I'm going to be with you. I'm going to be guiding and protecting you. And 1 Corinthians 15:58, therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. So brings up the possibility that our labor may be in vain. And in fact, if you read the Bible, you find that very much of human labor is in vain. Things we build fall down. We try to make a reputation for ourselves, and then everybody forgets who we are. We have clothing and wealth, and it rusts and breaks and cracks and falls away and rots. So human labor is often in vain if we're not doing it according to God's will. But work for God is not in vain, as in empty, pointless, futile. That's what vain means in this context. So the next slide, through the day of fire, 1 Corinthians 3:13-15, each one's work will become manifest, for the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed by fire. Fire will test what sort of work each one has done, work that anyone has built on the foundation. If the work that anyone has built on the foundation survives, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, though he himself will be saved, as if only through fire. So the work that we do will also be tested by God, and the figure or the idea here is that fire, if you build something that's flammable, it will burn up and you'll suffer loss. It doesn't mean that we can't build wood buildings. It's just meaning that as a figure of speech, our work can become futile and pointless, and that God will test that. So there are many kinds of work. Next slide. 1 Thessalonians, remembering before our God and Father your work of faith and labor of love, steadfastness of hope in our Lord Jesus Christ. So it's describing faith and love as work. It's the thing that we do as something that we're trying to accomplish, in this case for God, and through the strength of God. And then 1 Thessalonians 4:11, and to aspire to live quietly, and to mind your own affairs, and to work with your hands as we instructed you. Now, to understand this passage in Thessalonians, it's not saying that other kinds of work are inferior to working physically with your hands, but the Greeks had slaves, and they had come to think that that kind of physical work was not dignified enough for them to do. So they didn't want to work with their hands, and often didn't work at all. They saw themselves as philosophers and citizens, and so Paul was trying to, if you will, install a work ethic in the Thessalonian believers so that they could, in fact, live a good life before God. So 2 Thessalonians on the next slide, hard at work, that's 3:10-12, for even when we were with you, we would give you this command, if anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat. For we hear that some among you walk in idleness, not busy, but work, but busy bodies. Now such persons we command and encourage in the Lord to do their work quietly and to earn their own living. So once again, this idea of doing their work quietly and earning their own living was contrary to what they had been doing. So next slide, know the satisfaction. So this is really where I started from, and then I found lots of other things, so I included some of that. But I want you to know the satisfaction of a difficult task well done. And the only way for you to know that is to do it. We can't simulate it. You won't understand unless you do something hard, and then you have the satisfaction of seeing it done well. Colossians 3:23, whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men. So if we don't want our work to be empty or vain. We need to work according to God's will and for God. And it's saying here to do it essentially with an enthusiastic attitude, work heartily. And Ecclesiastes 4:4, going back in the Bible a bit, so I saw that there is nothing better than a man should rejoice in his work, for that is his lot. Who can bring him to see what will be after him? So Ecclesiastes has sort of a down attitude in a lot of it, but it's saying, you don't know what's going to happen, so enjoy this time, enjoy your work. And it's good advice, it's very wise. So finally, the last slide in conclusion, 2 Thessalonians 3:13, do not grow weary in doing good. It's not only talking about weariness, but I cannot control when I grow weary, obviously, but I can try to keep a positive attitude about what I'm doing, and I can try to carry it through faithfully and do it in the power of God and according to his will. Very often we find ourselves growing weary in doing good because we're trying to do that good in our own strength, but we need to do it in God's strength and according to his will, and he will supply us with what we need to finish it. So this passage means do not give up, and that would certainly be my message to you. Don't give up, work hard, enjoy your work. Thanks.